The political firestorm that erupted in Ottawa was, curiously, centered not on economic policy or international affairs, but on the seemingly mundane matter of orthography, a subtle shift in spelling within official government documents that quickly escalated into a high-stakes debate over national identity and cultural sovereignty. The controversy, initially spotted and amplified by linguistic watchdogs, revolved specifically around the usage of British English conventions, where long-established Canadian English norms typically dictated Americanized forms. At the heart of this linguistic skirmish was Prime Minister Mark Carney, a figure whose distinguished international career had, paradoxically, created a blind spot regarding domestic linguistic nuances.
It is likely that the usage of words such as organization instead of the conventionally Canadian organization or analyze over analyze stemmed directly from the Prime Minister's 7-year tenure as the Governor of the Bank of England in London. During that period, the immersion in British institutional language was total, and one might hypothesize that these habits were simply carried across the Atlantic upon his return, not as a deliberate policy deviation, but as an ingrained, perhaps unconscious, stylistic reflex.
However, in the highly sensitive landscape of Canadian cultural politics, where national self-definition often hinges on subtle differentiations from its powerful neighbors, such reflexes are rarely forgiven. The incident came into public view when several instances of this UK-style spelling were flagged in high-profile government releases, most notably within the recent federal budget, a document scrutinized for every comma and decimal, and in a joint press statement following a critical meeting with the U.S. President.
The specific choice of S instead of Z in key suffixes, while technically standard in Britain, was identified by critics as a clear departure from the accepted Canadian linguistic consensus that had been formalized and consistently adhered to by governmental and academic institutions for decades. The reaction was swift and organized, spearheaded not by political rivals, but by a coalition of 6 prominent Canadian linguists who issued a compelling open letter.
They warned that if the country's highest office began employing varied spelling systems, it could irrevocably destabilize what they argued was a carefully constructed and culturally significant linguistic standard. They posited that inconsistency emerging from the executive branch threatened to erode the very notion of a standardized Canadian English, which they passionately argued was a crucial element of the nation's self-regard and historical legacy.
The linguists emphasized that Canadian English is not merely a compromise between US and UK forms, rather it is a distinctive tapestry woven from multiple historical threads. It is rooted in the influx of United Empire loyalists following the American Revolution, subsequently seasoned by waves of migration from Britain, Scotland, Ireland, and global sources, incorporating unique loanwords from French and various indigenous languages, yielding terms such as talk or muskeg.
This unique, often idiosyncratic orthography, which generally prefers the American I's endings but retains British forms like check and maneuver, is viewed by linguistic purists as a hard-won cultural asset. It is a tangible reflection of national history, a subtle yet visible way to navigate the immense gravitational pull of both the American media landscape and the historical legacy of the Crown. The authors of the letter forcefully asserted that the deliberate institutional adoption of a uniquely Canadian style since the 1970s was an affirmation of sovereignty. Therefore, the Prime Minister's preference for organize over organize was perceived not as a typographical error, but as a symbolic surrender, or at best, a profound carelessness regarding national identity markers. The underlying question remains whether this controversy represents a substantive governance failure or is merely a manifestation of deeper political anxieties. On one hand, the practical ramifications are minimal. No budget was jeopardized by an extra S. However, the symbolic cost is arguably substantial, particularly for a government that has otherwise placed great emphasis on celebrating and promoting a distinct Canadian identity on the global stage. It is plausible that the criticism directed at Prime Minister Carney reflects a broader anxiety within Canada about maintaining cultural distinctiveness amidst powerful external pressures. If the very language used by the government cannot remain consistent and reflective of national standards, critics suggest, how strongly is the government committed to preserving other, more abstract elements of Canadian uniqueness?
The continued silence from the Prime Minister's office regarding the letter only further fueled the debate, leaving the initial incident to simmer as a powerful proxy war over who determines the precise texture and expression of modern Canadian nationhood. The fuel for the debate quickly materialized into organized resistance, specifically from the academic sector.
It is notable that shortly after the budget documents were made public, a collective of 6 highly respected Canadian linguists took the extraordinary step of drafting an open letter, moving the discussion from media speculation into formal scholarly criticism. This letter, addressed not just to the Prime Minister's office, but extending its scope to the entire government and Parliament, suggested that adherence to Canadian English spelling conventions, which they posited had been consistently utilized from the 1970s through to the present day, was essential for maintaining institutional clarity.
The primary concern, as one hypothesis suggests, was the erosion of standardization. The experts were not arguing merely for tradition, they presented a specific, pragmatic risk. They warned explicitly that if different governmental bodies began adopting various, non-standardized orthographies, it is likely that this confusion would lead to systemic uncertainty regarding what truly constitutes the accepted Canadian standard.
This ambiguity, though seemingly trivial on a dictionary level, could undermine decades of coordinated efforts aimed at codifying and protecting a unique linguistic space, impacting everything from legal documents to educational materials. To fully grasp the weight of their argument, we must briefly recall the historical formation of Canadian English, a context the linguists made central to their appeal.
It is a profoundly peculiar hybrid, shaped initially by loyalist migrations following the American Revolution, followed by continuous subsequent immigration from the UK, and, crucially, the deep influence of Indigenous and French languages. The resulting orthography is deliberately idiosyncratic. It rejects the full American tendency toward simplification, evidenced by the retention of certain British forms, such as check and maneuver. Yet it also discards other British archaisms like jail or tire. This stylistic balancing act stands as a visible middle ground, and for many concerned with identity, this unique orthographic position is a potent reflection of the country's national character, successfully maintaining Commonwealth historical ties while simultaneously asserting definitive North American independence.
The linguists emphasized that the currently accepted spelling reflects global influences and cultures, while simultaneously incorporating necessary vocabulary rooted in local and indigenous communities, citing examples like toque or muskeg. This intentional hybridity, they argued, was not an accident, but a conscious, collective decision representing a key element of national history, identity, and pride that warranted explicit defense by the highest levels of government. However, a critical analysis of the linguist's demand must acknowledge the significant challenges inherent in maintaining such a rigid standard in the contemporary context. While the preservation of a distinct orthography is academically and historically noble, it is plausible that the overwhelming influence of global digital communication, which is heavily dominated by American conventions, renders absolute consistency nearly impossible, even for government agencies operating under tight deadlines.
Furthermore, the very concept of maintaining the Canadian spelling standard is sometimes prone to accusations of arbitrariness. Deciding which British spelling to keep and which American spelling to adopt has historically been a matter of fluctuating editorial consensus and media influence, not fixed constitutional law.
Prime Minister Carney, having spent 7 years in a senior UK government-adjacent role, might reasonably argue that the continuity of his personal and institutional communication style is merely a practical matter of efficiency and ingrained habit, not a deliberate political statement intended to erode national identity.
One potential counter-argument, implicitly suggested by the PMO's continued silence, is whether the general Canadian public genuinely perceives this spelling variance as an existential threat, or whether this particular criticism remains confined primarily to a niche academic concern, thereby minimizing the need for an official high-level response.
Despite these practical counterpoints concerning globalization and administrative ease, the symbolic weight of the incident remains dominant in the political narrative. In an era where the current Canadian government often emphasizes a renewed focus on national identity, sovereignty, and reconciliation, elements that demand clear self-definition, the use of a borrowed, non-standard orthography becomes politically visible and vulnerable to scrutiny. It is undeniable that the decision to protect the accepted form of Canadian English is perhaps the most immediate and tangible way for a government to signal a commitment to preserving an essential component of national history, identity, and pride. The failure of the Prime Minister's office to offer an immediate public clarification or adjustment did not resolve the spelling dilemma. Rather, it strongly suggests that the PMO recognized the profound depth of the identity debate that the controversy represented and chose strategic silence over a potentially clumsy official statement that might inadvertently alienate either the academic community or the international financial community from which the Prime Minister had recently returned. Thus, the issue of S versus Z transcends mere grammar. It becomes the chosen battleground, a precise, quantifiable metric upon which the amorphous definition of modern Canadian nationhood continues to be contested. The small, seemingly harmless grammatical deviation served as a powerful litmus test, revealing the latent anxieties within the national project. The debate effectively closed the loop on the initial uncertainty. The language surrounding the budget was indeed political, not merely clerical, offering profound insight into the subconscious linguistic habits of the nation's leadership and solidifying the view that even the most minute detail in official discourse can carry monumental symbolic load. Before concluding our examination, we must state clearly that the analysis and commentary provided in this video are based solely on publicly available sources, academic publications, and reporting from recognized media outlets, and they represent the channel's own perspective and interpretation of the events surrounding this complex linguistic and political debate.